Our second major topic today is how we regulate appetite and consumption. So think about last time we talked about the process of digestion. So we want to talk about how we regulate upstream of that process. What is actually going to cause you to feel hungry and therefore eat something? We'll start by looking at the control of fat storage and metabolism, which is a critical part of homeostasis because it provides the energy to do everything else that you need to do. So what types of controls do you expect to be involved in these regulatory processes? Yeah, exactly. It's going to be negative feedback regulation because we're talking about homeostasis, so you want to stay within a normal range. Anytime you go out of that range, you need to have a mechanism to work against the stimulus to bring you back into the normal range. So these are going to be negative feedback regulatory mechanisms. Basically, in both the short term and the long term, we have a situation where if you have enough food, that's going to suppress the appetite. Involved in this regulation are going to be hormones and the nervous system. So it's going to operate much like the regulatory processes we've seen before. We're actually going to dive a little bit deeper into an example that we've seen before, which is glucose homeostasis, regulating the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. So we've seen this figure before. This just shows the regulatory mechanism where insulin and glucagon are released to bring the blood sugar back into the normal level if it gets too high or too low. The main organ involved in this regulation is the pancreas, which we've been talking about a lot, but we haven't really talked about as its own thing. So now finally the pancreas is going to get its own slide. I'm sure everybody has been waiting for that for months. So here is the pancreas located in the abdominal cavity, kind of just below the stomach here. So this one is the pancreas. The pancreas has two sets of functions. It's an exocrine gland in the context of digestion, so it's going to release pancreatic juices into the small intestine. You can see the ducts right there, the little tubes. So that's exocrine. That's going to be a lot of digestive enzymes in there. And then in terms of glucose regulation, it is an endocrine gland. So it's going to release glucagon and insulin, two hormones that are responsible for affecting blood sugar levels. These hormones are made in structures called pancreatic islets, and they contain two types of cells, alpha cells, which make glucagon, and beta cells, which secrete insulin. Now, what happens if there's a problem with this regulatory network? What results? Yeah, you know that it is diabetes. We've talked about this before. This is actually the most common endocrine disorder among, in particular, older people, but it is the most common endocrine disorder, diabetes. There are two causes for diabetes. The first is insulin deficiency. This is where it's an autoimmune condition where the beta cells are targeted by the immune system, so your body doesn't make enough insulin. And the second is called insulin resistance. It's a decreased response to insulin, so your body releases insulin, but the target cells in your muscles and liver don't respond to it. In both cases, we see abnormally high blood glucose levels. Now, for those of you that don't know, this is Wilford Brimley, who is great. And he's famous. It's funny, he has a long acting career, but he's most famous for his ads about diabetes awareness. And there have been tons of jokes about this, and it is very funny, and you should Google it. But also, you should know that Wilford Brimley has actually been very successful in terms of raising the awareness of diabetes, particularly among older people. And it's actually a big public health victory. This ad campaign was a major public health win because it actually brought down the cases of undiagnosed diabetes, made it more likely for diabetes to get diagnosed earlier, and therefore led to a decrease in the severe complications that result from long-term untreated diabetes. So way to go, Wilford Brimley. Thank you for your diabetes awareness, public health campaign, and also your magnificent mustache. The consequences of diabetes are that your cells are unable to take up glucose, which means your blood sugar stays too high, and your cells need to use a different source of energy. Fat becomes the main source of fuel for your cells, which has adverse consequences. When you break down fat, it results in acidic byproducts that accumulate in the blood. This decreases the pH of the bloodstream, and it messes with the ionic balance of the blood, so it depletes the sodium and the potassium in your bloodstream. This has one beneficial side effect, and it's that you will not die from the Andromeda strain. Just read the Andromeda strain, great book. If you get a chance, read the Andromeda strain, and then you'll get what I'm talking about. But this also has a bunch of negative consequences, which are way more important because they're actually real, unlike the Andromeda strain. So the severe consequences, if this happens over a long period of time, it can lead to blindness, kidney damage, gangrene, where you're having circulatory problems and then tissues like at the extremities are actually dying. And a sign of a very severe case of this is glucose in the urine. So you have so much glucose in the blood that it's actually being filtered out in the kidneys and being excreted in the urine. That's a sign of extremely severe diabetes, which can have very serious consequences. As I said a few minutes ago, there are two types of diabetes. There's two causes for this disorder. Type 1 diabetes is called insulin dependent, which makes up about 10% of cases, and type 2 is non-insulin dependent, and that's about 90% of cases. Type 1 is an autoimmune disorder where the beta cells in the pancreas are destroyed by your own immune system. That leads to insulin deficiency. Type 2 is insulin resistance, where over time you have too much sugar in your blood over long periods of time. Your pancreas is constantly releasing insulin, which leads to the cells that respond to insulin decreasing the density of insulin receptors. So over time, they stop responding effectively to that signal. Some risk factors for type 2 diabetes are being overweight and having very little exercise in your life. So make sure you're getting plenty of exercise. Type 1 diabetes used to be called childhood diabetes or early onset diabetes because typically it appears before age 30. Type 2 used to be called adult onset or late onset because it usually appears after age 40. But for some period of time, we were actually seeing type 2 diabetes appear in much younger people due to an unhealthy lifestyle, diet, and being overweight. So we don't use the early onset versus adult onset terminology anymore. We just say type 1 versus type 2. The treatment for type 1 diabetes is pretty simple. It's just insulin injection. So you need to inject insulin to replace the insulin that is lost due to the lack of beta cells. Type 2 is a little more complicated because there's no one specific thing causing it. So you can control it with exercise and carefully regulating your diet and checking your blood sugar frequently, but it does sometimes require medication to get that blood sugar under control. So again, glucose regulation is a really good example of this regulatory mechanism in the short term, but we also want to look at how things like appetite are regulated in the long term. To do that, we're going to look at the hormonal regulation and the nervous system regulation of appetite. We're going to start with a hormone called ghrelin, which is secreted by the stomach wall and triggers hunger. Basically, you have stretch receptors in your stomach wall. If the stomach is stretched, meaning it's full, then you don't release ghrelin. If the stomach is contracted, so it's not stretched, it's small and therefore it's empty, those receptors are going to detect that and trigger the release of this hormone ghrelin, which triggers hunger. A good way to remember this is when you're hungry, when your stomach is growling. Because it sounds like growling, but ghrelin, because it's the hormone that makes you hungry. Okay, so that's ghrelin in the stomach. So that's pretty short term. Insulin is also involved in regulating appetite. As we know, insulin is triggered by an increase in blood sugar, and this suppresses the appetite in addition to bringing the blood sugar down. Basically, this is saying, hey, we've got plenty of sugar circulating in our bloodstream right now. We don't need any more, so you're not hungry right now. You're good. And then there is a hormone called PYY, which just stands for peptide YY because Y is the one-letter symbol for an amino acid. It's tyrosine. You don't need to know that. But it has two tyrosines next to each other, so we call it peptide YY. This is from the small intestine, and it is also an appetite suppressant. Basically, the small intestine releases PYY when food is present, saying, I'm good, I don't need any more food, you don't need to eat anymore, I have food right here, so just, you're good. The final hormone we'll look at here is called leptin. Leptin is produced by adipose tissue, and this is an appetite suppressant, but it's a long-term response. So this is not going to vary with each meal. This responds to the level of fat in the body. So as fat accumulates, that adipose tissue releases leptin, which is a longer-term appetite suppressant. These hormonal signals are going to be detected by the brain, and the brain is going to then perceive either being hungry or being full. So you have sensory neurons and sensory receptors that are taking in this information from the digestive system. It's regulating the hormones that are secreted that we just talked about. And then those hormones are being detected by the brain in a region called the satiety center. This is the center that is going to perceive being hungry or being full. So this part of the brain takes in all of those different hormonal signals, and whatever the net effect is, that's what you're going to perceive, whether you're hungry or you're full.